Mia Farrow is 81 years old. In 2025, she appeared on Broadway in The Roommate. Reviews were positive. She was working. She was present. She was, by every account of her public appearances, a woman who had not stopped. But stop for a moment. Before we go any further, I want you to think about what it means to be 81 years old and still working, still showing up, still putting on a performance every night for a paying audience. Because there are two ways to read that. The first way is the way the profile writers read it. Resilience, strength, survival. A woman who outlasted the scandal. A woman who kept going when lesser people would have stopped. The second way is harder to say out loud. What if not stopping times is the story? What if the inability to be still, the constant movement, the constant reinvention, the constant presence in front of audiences who are watching, what if that is not strength? What if that is something else? I am not diagnosing Mia Farrow. I am not a psychologist. I am not inside her head. But I am asking you to hold that question because in 10 minutes, when we get to the part of this video that the other tellings never reach you, are going to need it. She has outlived 3 of her children. Say that again slowly. She has outlived 3 of her children. Not 1, 3. Lark, Tom, Thaddius. 3 children who came from other countries, from Vietnam, from South Korea, who arrived in America inside a family the entire world was watching and who died before their mother. Now, in 30 years of coverage of the Farrow Allen story, I want you to count in your head how many times you have seen a documentary stop at that sentence. Not move past it, not mention it in a list and keep going. Actually, times stop. Actually ask the question that sentence demands. Because the question it demands is not complicated. It is the most basic question in journalism. What happened? She has watched Ronan become one of the most significant investigative journalists of his generation. The reporter whose work on Harvey Weinstein helped trigger the Me Too movement. Whose Pulitzer Prize represents a kind of public vindication that is real, and that is also, in the specific way that public vindication always is times, insufficient times, to address what it is being applied to. Here is what I mean by that. A Pulitzer Prize is given to journalism. It is recognition of craft, of courage, of the willingness to pursue a story that powerful people want buried and to publish it anyway. What Ronan did was real. What it cost him personally, professionally, in terms of the specific weight of being the son of Mia Farrow and the alleged son of Woody Allen, walking into a story about powerful men who abuse women, the weight of that is not small. But a Pulitzer Prize does not heal a family. It does not bring back Lark. It does not answer the question of what Tam's final days looked like. It does not add years to Thaddius's life. Public vindication is for the public. The family pays a different kind of bill. And in the Farrow family, across decades, the people who paid the highest bills were consistently the ones the cameras could not find. She has watched Dylan continue to maintain for more than 30 years that what she has said happened in the attic on the 4th of August, 1992, happened. That she was 7 years old. That she is telling the truth. That the men who protected Allen and the institutions that chose not to prosecute made a decision about whose account mattered more. And here is something I want to say about Dylan Farrow that the coverage has consistently failed to say cleanly. Whatever you believe about the allegation, whatever position you hold, whatever evidence you find most credible, whatever conclusion you have reached after 30 years of this story being litigated in public, there is one thing that is not in dispute. Dylan Farrow has been consistent. She has not changed her account. She has not softened it. She has not been caught in a contradiction. She has told the same story, with the same specific details, for 30 years, including years when telling it cost her professionally, personally, and emotionally, in ways that were visible and documented. That does not automatically mean the allegation is true. Consistency is not proof, but at times is times something. And the specific way that powerful people in the entertainment industry treated consistency as if it were suspicious, as if a woman who does not change her story must be coached or manipulated, that treatment tells you something about the machinery that surrounds stories like this one. She has watched Moses take the opposite position. publicly, in a blog post that was shared widely, in a statement that accused Mia of abuse and defended Alan. Moses is now a therapist. He and Mia are estranged. Stop there for a moment, too. Moses Farrow, a man who grew up inside that household, who was adopted by Mia, who watched everything that this video has been describing from the inside, has looked at his own childhood and concluded something different from what Dylan concluded. And both of them were there. Both of them have memories. Both of them have pain. Both of them have built their adult identities partly in relation to what happened inside that family. And they have landed in opposite places. What does that tell you? It does not tell you that one of them is lying. People can experience the same environment and reach genuinely different conclusions, especially when the environment was chaotic, especially when the adults in it were at war with each other, especially when the cameras were always running and the story being told to the outside world was consistently different from whatever was happening inside. What it tells you is that this family was times fractured, times in ways that go deeper than any single allegation. What it tells you is that the fracture lines run through every person who survived childhood inside it. And it tells you again that the people who did not survive deserve to be part of this accounting. She has watched Woody Allen continue to make films. Until Me Too. Until the Amazon withdrawal. Until the moment when the industry that had protected him for decades finally, partially, imperfectly, incompletely stopped. Here is the timeline that the coverage usually presents when it talks about accountability for Woody Allen. The allegation, the investigation, the decision not to prosecute, the custody ruling, decades of films, Me Too, Amazon, the cancellation. That timeline is not wrong, but it is missing something. It is missing the names of every single person who made a decision along that timeline. Every executive who greenlit a project after the allegation, every actor who chose to work with him, and then when Me Too made that choice costly, issued a public statement of regret that they had not thought about Dylan sooner. Every journalist who wrote a profile that described him as complicated but brilliant without giving that sentence the examination it deserved. Every institution that looked at what was known and decided that what was known was not sufficient to change behavior. Accountability in a story like this one is not just about the person at the center of the allegation. It is about every node in the network that made the center possible. And that network in the case of Woody Allen was vast, well-funded, critically celebrated, and deeply reluctant to examine itself. She has watched the Epstein Files released. This is the part that changes the context in ways the earlier coverage could not have known. Because the Epstein connection, the documented presence of Woody Allen at gatherings connected to Jeffrey Epstein, the overlap between their social worlds does not prove anything about the allegation made by Dylan Farrow. Let me be precise about that. The Epstein connection is not evidence of what happened on the 4th of August, 1992, but it is evidence of something else. It is evidence of a specific social and professional ecosystem, a world of powerful men in New York and the Hamptons, and elite intellectual circles where certain behaviors were known, tolerated, celebrated, and protected by people who had every reason to know better. And when you place the Farrow-Allen story inside that ecosystem, when you look at it not as an isolated event involving one family, but as one data point in a much larger pattern, the question of why the institutions did not act differently becomes easier to answer. They did not act differently because the ecosystem rewarded not acting differently. The ecosystem rewarded looking away. The ecosystem had, for decades, organized itself around the protection of powerful men at the expense of the people those men had access to. That is the context. And that context matters not because it resolves Dylan's allegation, but because it tells you something true about the world inside which the allegation was made, and the world inside which it was dismissed. She is 81 years old. And here is the question this video has been building towards since the first frame. What does accountability look like in a story like this one? Not Allen's accountability alone. The accountability question this video is asking is different. It is asking about the children nobody noticed. Because a story about accountability that only covers the people the cameras follow is not a complete accounting. It is a highlight reel. And highlight reels, by definition, leave things out. Lark came from Vietnam in 1973. She arrived in a country that was not her own, as a child, into a family that the world was watching. She grew up inside that family. She became an adult. She had children of her own. She had HIV. She had struggled. She had lived inside a household that the world was watching constantly. And in all of that watching, no camera ever stopped on her long enough to ask what she needed. She died at 35, on Christmas Day. And when she died, the world looked away. Not because Lark was unknown. She was a Farrow. Her name appeared in profiles. Her adoption was celebrated as part of the narrative of Mia's extraordinary generosity. But her death, the specific circumstances of it, the question of how a 35-year-old woman with HIV inside a story the entire world was following, that question did not generate coverage, because it did not generate the kind of drama the cameras were calibrated to find. A woman dying slowly and quietly and young is not the kind of drama that becomes a documentary chapter, unless someone decides it should be. Tam came from Vietnam in 1992. She was blind. She was 16 when she arrived. She was 17 when she died. The circumstances of her death are disputed between the two surviving people who describe themselves as having been closest to what happened. I want to stay on that sentence for longer than the coverage has allowed. Two people, both inside the household, both present, both claiming proximity to what happened. Two different accounts of how a 17-year-old girl died. That is not a footnote. That is not a detail to be mentioned and moved past. That is at minimum a story. A real one. A story with a dead 17-year-old girl at the center of it, and two adults who tell different versions of what she experienced in her final days. And in 30 years of coverage of the Farrow family, in documentaries and books and streaming series and podcast episodes, that story has never been told as a story. It has been mentioned. It has been listed. It has not been told. Thaddius came from South Korea. He grew up in a household the cameras never left. He became a man. He built a life that the cameras, because it did not involve drama that fit the established narrative, did not follow. He died at 27 on Route 67. The world gave it a news item, not a chapter, not a documentary segment, not the kind of sustained, serious coverage that asks what led a 27-year-old man to that road on that day. A news item, and then silence. These three deaths, in a story that the world has processed as being primarily about Alan and Dylan, and the allegation, and the Polaroids, and the custody battle, are the accountability gap that nobody has filled. Not because Mia is necessarily culpable for them in a legal or criminal sense. I want to be precise about that. This video is not making a legal claim. It is not asserting that Mia Farrow is criminally responsible for what happened to Lark, or Tam, or Thaddius. But precision about legal culpability is not the same as a complete moral accounting. And the complete moral accounting, the honest one, the one that uses all the documented facts and does not organize them only around the most familiar drama, includes this. 3 children arrived. 3 children died young. The family they arrived into was celebrated continuously as an expression of extraordinary love and generosity. The coverage gap that surrounded those deaths while the cameras stayed fixed on the parts of the story that generated more familiar headlines is the honest thing about this story that no documentary has told. The cameras chose the drama they understood. Lark and Tam and Thaddius were not that kind of drama. So the cameras looked away. And in looking away, the cameras made a choice. That choice has a name. It is not murder. It is not malice. It is indifference. And indifference in journalism, in storytelling, in the act of deciding whose life deserves a chapter, is its own kind of accountability failure. Let me tell you what this video has actually been doing since the first frame. Not what it said it was doing, what it was times actually times doing. It has been trying to do the thing that 30 years of coverage of the Farrow Allen story has never done. It has been trying to make 3 people the center of the story they were always inside. Lark, Tom, Thaddius. Now, before I finish, I want to talk to you directly. Not as a narrator, not as someone reading from a script. As someone who spent a significant amount of time inside this material, reading the court documents, reading the profiles, reading the open letters and the blog posts and the Academy Awards season think pieces and the streaming series breakdowns, and noticing every single time what the material was organized around. It was organized around the allegation, which is understandable. The allegation is serious. The allegation involves a child. The allegation, if true, represents a profound abuse of trust and power, and the specific vulnerability of a 7-year-old girl who could not protect herself. I am not saying the allegation should not be the center of some of the coverage. I am saying it should not be the center of times, all times of it. Because in making the allegation, the organizing principle of every telling in building every documentary, every book chapter, every podcast episode, around the question of times, what happened in the attic, times the coverage, has made an invisible editorial choice. It has decided that Dylan's story is the story that matters. And Dylan's story does matter. But Lark's story also matters. And Tam's story also matters. And Thaddius' story also matters. And the specific, documentable fact that those 3 stories have been consistently excluded from the coverage, not by accident, not by oversight, but by the structural logic of a media culture that organizes around recognizable drama times, that times is the story this video has been trying to tell. This video cannot tell you definitively what happened inside that household. I need to be honest about that. It cannot resolve the dispute between Moses and Mia about Tam's final days. It cannot confirm Dylan's allegation or refute it, because those questions were not resolved by the institutions that examined them, and this video does not have access to evidence those institutions did not have. If someone tells you they, times, can, times, resolve those questions, be skeptical. The honest position, the one that respects the complexity of what actually happened, is uncertainty about the things that remain genuinely uncertain, and clarity about the things that are documented. What is documented? 3 children came from other countries into this family. 3 children died young. The coverage of those deaths was minimal compared to the coverage of the allegation and the custody battle. The people who should have asked questions, the journalists, the documentarians, the institutions of media that were paying close attention to this family for decades, did not ask those questions. That is documented. That is the story this video is telling. What it can do, what it has tried to do, is be honest about what the coverage chose and what the coverage left out. The coverage chose the drama. And the drama was real. I am not dismissing it. The Polaroids were real. The allegation was real. The custody battle was real. The Epstein connection is real and documented, and changes the context of a story that needed its context changed. But context is not only about adding new drama. Context is also about expanding the frame to include the people who were always inside the story, but never inside the camera. Lark was always inside the story. Tam was always inside the story. Thaddius was always inside the story. The camera just never found them interesting enough to stay on. And here is what I want you to sit with before you close this video. The media culture that made those choices, the editors and producers, and journalists and documentarians who looked at this story and organized it around the most legible drama, that culture is not something that exists separately from us. We are part of it. Every time we click on the story about the allegation and scroll past the story about the quiet death, we are part of it. Every time we engage with the drama and move on before asking about the people the drama consumed, we are part of it. Every time we share the documentary that covers the Polaroids and not the one that covers the children who didn't survive, we are part of it. I am not saying this to make you feel guilty. I am saying it because accountability, real accountability, the kind that actually changes behavior and not just generates a news cycle, requires including ourselves in the accounting. It requires asking not just times what did they do wrong times, but times what did we choose to look at times, and times what did we choose to look away from times, and times why. Lark was 35. She was a mother. She had children of her own. She had lived through things that the profiles celebrating her adoption never asked about. She had arrived in America as a child and built a life, and that life ended at 35 on Christmas Day. Tam was 17. She was blind. She was new to this country. She was 16 when she arrived and 17 when she died. She had survived whatever it was. She survived before the adoption, and then she died before she had the chance to become an adult with choices of her own. Thaddius was 27. He had made it further than Tam. He had built more of an adult life. He had 27 years. And then he had Route 67. And then he had a news item. And then he had silence. All three came from countries where they had already survived things, where survival itself was the achievement, where arriving at an age where you could make your own decisions was not guaranteed. All three made it to America. All three made it into a family that the world was watching. And all three left that family and this world without the world stopping to watch. I want to ask you something before you go. The story of the Farrow family has been told dozens of times. In documentaries and books and open letters and blog posts and Academy Award season debates and streaming series and podcast episodes and long-form magazine profiles and celebrity memoir chapters and think pieces and counterthink pieces and takes and countertakes. In all of those tellings, how many times did you hear the name Lark? How many times did you hear the name Tam? How many times did you hear the name Thaddius? Not mentioned in passing, not listed in a footnote, heard, as in someone stopped and said the name, and then kept talking about that person like they mattered as much as everyone else in the story. How many times did that happen? Leave your answer in the comments below. Be honest. Because honesty, the specific, uncomfortable kind that requires admitting what we chose to consume and what we chose to ignore, is the only thing that makes this conversation worth having. And then, if this video said something the other tellings did not say, share it. Not for the algorithm, not for the engagement metrics. Because the least we owe the people that the story left out is to say their names once clearly, without a footnote, without moving on too quickly, without letting the next piece of drama pull our attention away before we've actually registered what we just heard. The least we owe them is 30 seconds of stillness. So, Lark. She was 35. She was a mother. She deserved more than a news item. Tam. She was 17. She was blind. She had just arrived. She deserved a chapter, not a footnote. Thaddius. He was 27. He had made it further. He still didn't make it far enough. He deserved someone to stop on Route 67 and ask the real question. These are not footnotes. These are not supporting characters in someone else's story. These are the story. They were always the story. We just weren't looking at the right part of the frame. This is Mary of Shadows. Thank you for being here, and thank you specifically for staying until the end. Because the people who stay until the end are the people who were willing to sit with something uncomfortable long enough to actually feel it. That is not nothing. That is actually the beginning of something. The three names. The world knows three names from Mia Farrow's story. Ronan, Dylan, Woody Allen. These are the names that the documentaries use, the names that appear in the headlines, the names that organize the narrative of what happened inside one of the most scrutinized families in Hollywood history. The world does not know three other names. Lark, Tam, Thaddius. One died at 17, one died at 35, one died at 27. All three were adopted. All three had come from places where survival was not guaranteed. From Vietnam, from Korea, from the circumstances that bring children to orphanages in countries that the wealthy Western world adopts from and rarely thinks about afterward. All three were brought into a family that the world was watching very carefully, and all three died inside it. When they died, the documentaries did not stop. The headlines did not shift. The names that organized the story remained the same names. Ronan, Dylan, Woody Allen. Lark, Tam, and Thaddius remained what they had always been inside the story of their family. The ones nobody mentioned. I am Mary. And today this video is going to do what the coverage of this family has never done. It is going to say their names, not as footnotes, not as supporting details in someone else's scandal, not as statistics in a narrative about adoption or wealth or Hollywood dysfunction. As people, 3 people who came from the hardest circumstances the world produces, and who were placed inside a family that the cameras never left, and who died, one by one, in the spaces between the headlines. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, the story you thought you knew about Mia Farrow's family will look different. Not because this video is going to tell you what to think, but because it is going to show you what the coverage chose not to see. And what it chose not to see has 3 names: Lark, Tam, Thaddius. Before Lark, before Tam, before Thaddius, before the Polaroids and the allegation and the custody battle and everything that the world has spent 30 years arguing about, there was a woman who had survived things of her own. What Mia Farrow brought into the project of building her family, what her own history contributed to the specific, documented way that family was constructed, is the context that the coverage has always been in too much of a hurry to examine. That is coming. Mia, before the family. Mia Farrow was born on the 9th of February 1945 in Los Angeles, California. She was the 3rd child of John Villiers Farrow, a film director of Australian origin, whose relationship with the church, with fidelity, and with the women in his life was complicated, in ways that his public Catholicism did not resolve. And Maureen O'Sullivan, the Irish actress best known for playing Jane in the Tarzan films of the 1930s. The household Mia grew up in was large. 7 children eventually, Catholic, shaped by the specific Irish-American Catholic culture of mid-century Los Angeles, in which faith and discipline and the performance of family were woven together into a life that looked, from the outside, complete. From the inside, it was more complicated. Her father's infidelities were not hidden from the family with the care that some men of his generation exercised. Her mother's resilience in absorbing them was the performance of a woman who had no real alternative. The model Mia observed was the specific familiar one of a household where the institution of the family was maintained at the cost of what honesty about the institution would have required. When Mia was 9 years old, she contracted polio. The illness kept her hospitalized for weeks. It isolated her during a period of childhood when isolation is specific in its damage from her siblings, from her school, from the ordinary texture of a life she had been living alongside other people. She recovered. She retained no permanent physical disability from the illness, but the experience of being separated, of being alone in a medical context, 10 of understanding at 9 years old that the body could simply stop cooperating without warning, was not something that left without taking something with it. She was a serious child. She was, by the accounts of people who knew her during her school years, creative in the specific, interior way of someone who had spent significant time alone and had developed in that solitude a rich internal life that the external world did not always have access to. She was also, and this is documented by the trajectory of her adult choices, someone for whom the project of building something was more compelling than the project of maintaining something. The building was where the meaning was. The maintaining was where the cost became visible. At 17 years old, she began working as an actress. By 20, she was cast in Peyton Place, the television series that made her briefly the most recognizable young face in American entertainment. At 21, she married Frank Sinatra. Sinatra was 50 years old. The marriage lasted 2 years. It ended, famously, when Sinatra issued Mia an ultimatum: leave the production of Rosemary's Baby to film a movie with him, or face a divorce filing. She stayed in Rosemary's Baby. Sinatra filed. Their relationship, which had attracted the specific, loud, generationally inflected commentary of a culture that was not yet sure what to do with a 21-year-old marrying a 50-year-old, continued in various forms for years after the legal marriage ended. She would later say, in 1992, to Vanity Fair, that Ronan, her son officially fathered by her second husband Andre Previn, might possibly be Frank Sinatra's son. She did not elaborate beyond the suggestion. Ronan Farrow has occasionally addressed the question in interviews. No DNA test has been made public. The question has never been resolved. And here is what this detail tells us about Mia Farrow, not as gossip, but as context. She was a woman who understood the power of information, who knew what saying something without fully saying it could do, who had watched, from the inside of a family defined by the gap between its public presentation and its private reality, what the management of narrative looked like. She did not release that information carelessly. She released it at a specific, strategic moment during the worst period of the custody battle with Alan, when anything that added complexity to the question of who was a reliable narrator in this story served a purpose. The detail about Sinatra was not random. Neither was anything else about how Mia Farrow managed the story of her family. And what gets lost in the management of that story, what the managing of the Ronan question, and the Dylan allegation, and the Moses contradiction, and the Woody Allen narrative has always displaced, are three other names. Three children who did not survive their portion of the story. Three children who had no public advocates, and no high-profile defenders, and no documentary deals, and no platforms from which to speak. Three children who came from the hardest places and died in the spaces the cameras never reached. Lark Farrow was adopted from Vietnam in 1973. She was brought into the family when Mia was still married to Andre Previn, when the household was stable, before any of the subsequent chaos. What Lark's life inside the family looked like, what the accounts of people who knew her describe, and what happened on Christmas Day 2008 is the part of this story that the coverage has never told properly. That is coming. Lark Farrow was adopted from Vietnam in 1973. She was the fourth child Mia adopted, and among the first wave of children who came into the family before the household became what it eventually became, before the connection to Woody Allen, before the Upper West Side apartment, before the specific, consuming chaos of the early 1990s that would reorganize the family's public identity permanently. Lark arrived into a household that was, in relative terms, stable. Mia was married to Andre Previn. They had biological children together, twins, Matthew and Sasha, and then Fletcher. The family lived in England, where Previn was conducting the London Symphony Orchestra. The project of building a large multicultural family was one that Mia had been pursuing with what the accounts of that period describe as genuine commitment, not performing commitment, but the actual, daily work of managing a household of significant complexity. What do we know about Lark specifically? Less than we should. This is the answer to that question, and it is the most honest thing this video can say about the coverage of Lark Farrow's life. The accounts that exist of her as a child in the various books and documentaries and journalistic accounts that have examined the Farrow-Allen story mention her in the specific way that supporting characters are mentioned. She was there, she was present, she was one of the children. What the accounts do not do, what none of the coverage has ever done, is center her. What we know from the people who did know her is that Lark was close to her mother, that she was described by friends as warm, as someone whose presence in a room was felt without being announced, that she had struggled as many of the children who came into the family with the specific, invisible damage of early deprivation struggled with the specific challenges that the formal therapeutic language of the 1970s and 1980s was not yet well equipped to address. She was HIV positive. This is the fact that the coverage of the family in its focus on the Allen Farrow drama, on the Polaroids, and the allegation, and the custody battle, and the decades of subsequent debate, consistently failed to adequately acknowledge. Lark Farrow lived with HIV. In an era before the treatment advances that made HIV a manageable chronic condition for people who had access to them, this was a different prognosis than it is now. The specific, daily weight of that, in a family already managing the weight of significant public scrutiny, of the Allen fallout, of the specific, ongoing difficulty of being a child inside a household that the world was watching was not nothing. On Christmas Day 2008, Lark Farrow died. She was 35 years old. The coverage of her death was minimal. The same outlets that had covered every development in the Allen Farrow story for 16 years, that had written thousands of words about Polaroids and allegations and custody hearings and Hollywood dinners, gave Lark's death a paragraph. Mia announced it quietly. The family grieved privately. And the story that the cameras had never left moved on without stopping for the 35-year-old woman who had died on Christmas Day alone, by the accounts that exist, without the specific, gathered attention of a world that had been watching her family very closely for a very long time. Nobody said her name. Not in the way that the coverage said Ronan's name, or Dylan's name, or Woody Allen's name. Lark. She was 35 years old. She came from Vietnam in 1973. She died on Christmas Day, 2008. And the documentary that was released about her family the following year, the one that interviewed Mia extensively, that covered the Allen story in detail, that gave significant time to Dylan's allegation and Moses's response, and the specific, ongoing debate about what had or had not happened in the attic, did not make Lark the center of anything. She remained what she had always been inside the story, the one nobody mentioned. Tam Farrow was adopted from Vietnam in 1992. She was 16 years old when she arrived. She had been blind since childhood. She was 17 when she died. What happened to Tam Farrow and the specific, documented dispute between Mia Farrow and Moses Farrow about what her death actually was is the most contested detail in the family's internal history. And it tells you more about what was happening inside that household than anything the Allen Farrow trial ever produced. That is coming. Tam Farrow was adopted from Vietnam in 1992. She was approximately 16 years old when she arrived. The exact birth date, as with many children adopted from Vietnamese orphanages in that era, was an approximation rather than a certainty. She had been blind since childhood. She had survived the specific, compacted difficulty of a Vietnamese orphanage during a period of significant social and political instability. She was, by every account, a person of remarkable resilience for the simple reason that arriving at 16 in a new country, in a new language, in a household of enormous complexity, with a physical disability that the family was learning to accommodate, is an amount of change that most people could not process, and that Tam navigated without the benefit of having chosen it. She died in 2000. She was 17 years old. The cause of her death became one of the most disputed details in the internal history of the Farrow family. And the dispute itself tells you more about what was happening inside that household than any of the external coverage of the Allen Farrow drama ever managed to illuminate. Mia Farrow, in interviews, described Tam's death as cardiac-related, a heart condition, something congenital. The framing was of a medical event, painful, sudden, but not the result of anything that the household had produced or contributed to. Moses Farrow, in his 2018 blog post, in which he accused Mia of systematic emotional abuse of the children in her care and defended Woody Allen against Dylan's allegation, described Tam's death differently. Moses said Tam had struggled, that the household had not adequately addressed what Tam needed, that the specific, enormous challenges of a blind 16-year-old arriving into that household had not been met with sufficient support. That Tam's death was not simply medical, that the circumstances were more complicated than the cardiac explanation suggested. Mia disputes Moses's account. Moses disputes Mia's. Both accounts cannot be fully verified from the outside. Both accounts are partial. Both accounts tell a specific, interested version of what happened to a 17-year-old girl who came from Vietnam in 1992 and was dead before she turned 18. And here is the honest thing this video wants to say about that dispute. It does not matter which account is correct in terms of what it tells us about Tam. What matters, what the dispute between Moses and Mia reveals, regardless of whose specific version is more accurate, is that a 17-year-old girl died inside this family. And the world, which had been watching this family with extraordinary intensity since 1992, did not stop to ask what had happened to her. Not seriously. Not in the sustained, probing way that the world had asked what happened in the attic on the 4th of August 1992. Tam died in 2000. The Allen Farrow story continued. The documentaries came. The open letters came. The Academy Award season debates came. The conversations about whether Dylan was telling the truth came, over and over, in the specific, grinding cycle of a story that the culture could not resolve and therefore could not leave. And Tam remained on the margins of all of it. A 17-year-old who arrived from Vietnam and did not survive the year of her 18th birthday. Nobody made her the center of anything. Nobody said her name. On the 21st of September 2016, on Route 67 inches, Roxbury, Connecticut, Thaddius Farrow died. He was 27 years old. He had been adopted from Korea. He had grown up inside a family that the world had been watching since before he arrived. What the last years of his life looked like, and what his death reveals about what it cost to grow up as one of the children the cameras never focused on, is the most recent and the most painful part of this story. That is coming. Thaddius. Thaddius Lark Farrow was adopted from South Korea. He arrived in the family during the period the mid to late 1980s, when the household was already large, already complex, already the subject of a level of public attention that most households never experience. The world that Thaddius was brought into was not a quiet one. He grew up in the specific, difficult position of being one of the children who were neither the story nor entirely outside it. He was not Ronan, the son whose biological paternity had become a cultural question mark, who had gone on to win the Pulitzer Prize, whose public profile had become its own significant story. He was not Dylan, whose allegation had organized the family's public narrative for decades. He was not Moses, who had taken the opposite position from Dylan and written at length about it. He was Thaddius, one of the others, one of the children the cameras had not focused on. He had grown up. He had tried to build a life. He had done what people who grow up inside very complicated families with very public problems do. He had tried to exist outside the story, while the story continued around him. On the 21st of September, 2016, on Route 67 inches, Roxbury, Connecticut, Thaddius Farrow died. He was 27 years old. The cause was a car accident. The manner of death, the question of whether it was an accident or something else, was investigated and has been described by Mia as a suicide. He was 27. The coverage of his death was brief. The same outlets that had followed the Alan Farrow story for 24 years gave it a news item. Mia acknowledged it publicly with the grief of a mother who had now buried 3 of her children, and the story moved on. Because the story had never really included Thaddius. He had been one of the children. The cameras passed over on the way to the children who were part of the narrative. He had been one of the 14 names on the list that people cited when they discussed the scale of Mia Farrow's adoption project. He had been, in the specific reductive way that large families are discussed, one of the numbers. He was 27 years old. He came from South Korea. He grew up inside a family that the world watched constantly, and the world did not watch him. 3 children: Lark, Tam, Thaddius, 35, 17, 27. Christmas Day, the year 2000, the 21st of September 2016. 3 deaths. 3 lives that existed almost entirely outside the coverage of a family that was almost never outside the coverage. And here is the question that this coverage gap forces the question that the story of Lark and Tam and Thaddius makes unavoidable. What does it mean to build a very public family, to make the building of that family part of your public identity, to allow the cameras in, to give interviews about the project of creating this extraordinary, multicultural, deliberately constructed household, and to have 3 children die inside it without the same public accountability that the household's other crises generated? This is not a question with a clean answer, but it is a question that Lark and Tam and Thaddius deserve to have asked. For the first time, in 2026, the Jeffrey Epstein Files were released. Among the names in those files was one that changes how you read the entire Alan Farrow story. Not because it confirms what Dylan has said for 30 years, but because it confirms something about the man who walked away from that family and about where he went after he left. What the Epstein Files show about Woody Allen and Soon-Yi Previn is coming. And it is documented. And it matters. The Epstein Files. In 2026, the Jeffrey Epstein Files were released. Jeffrey Epstein was a financier and convicted sex trafficker whose connections to powerful men in business, politics, and entertainment had been documented for years, and whose death in a New York jail in 2019 ruled a suicide. Disputed by many, did not end the investigation into the network he had built and the people who had inhabited it. The 2026 release of additional files and correspondence added names to what was already a significant and disturbing documented record. Among the correspondence released, emails involving Soon-Yi Previn. Soon-Yi Previn, who had been adopted by Mia Farrow and Andre Previn, who had been the subject of the Polaroids that Mia discovered in January 1992, who had married Woody Allen in 1997 and had, by the time of the Epstein correspondence, been his wife for nearly 20 years. What the files show, as reported by The Guardian and other outlets in 2026, is this. Soon-Yi Previn corresponded with Jeffrey Epstein through 2018. In those emails, she thanked Epstein for connecting their family with the president of Bard College to assist with college admission for their daughter. The files also document that Epstein arranged a 2015 White House tour for Woody Allen and Soon-Yi Previn. The files also document Soon-Yi's stated view that the Me Too movement had gone too far. Now, this video is going to be precise about what these files establish and what they do not establish. They establish that Woody Allen and Soon-Yi Previn had a relationship with Jeffrey Epstein, that they corresponded with him, that they accepted favors from him, that they were part of the network of powerful people who maintained social and professional relationships with a man who was a convicted sex offender and whose subsequent investigation revealed the full scope of what those relationships had enabled. They do not establish that Allen committed additional crimes beyond those Dylan has alleged. They do not confirm Dylan's allegation. They do not resolve the question of what happened in the attic on the 4th of August, 1992. What they do in the specific, documented way of evidence that adds context without providing definitive conclusion is change the frame through which the entire Alan Farrow story is understood. The man who walked away from the custody battle, who was denied access to his children by a judge who described his relationship with them as grossly inappropriate, who had the state's attorney in Connecticut conclude there was probable cause to prosecute but choose not to protect the child from the trauma of a trial. That man corresponded with Jeffrey Epstein, accepted White House tours arranged by Jeffrey Epstein, and his wife, the woman at the center of the 1992 crisis, whose discovery in those Polaroids had triggered everything that followed, wrote to Epstein that the movement to believe and protect women had gone too far. This is the documented record, and it does not make the story of Lark, Tam, and Thaddius easier to process. If anything, it makes it harder, because here is what it means when held alongside the 3 deaths. 3 children died inside Mia Farrow's family, one at 17, one at 35, one at 27. The coverage of the family barely registered their deaths. The story remained organized around names and a scandal that had been running for 30 years. And the man at the center of that scandal, who had never been charged, who had continued working, who had received awards and continued making films with the full cooperation of Hollywood, was connected, through documented correspondence, to the man the entire world eventually agreed was one of the most prolific sexual predators in recent American history. Nobody said Lark's name. Nobody said Tam's name. Nobody said Thaddius's name. The story went on. Mia Farrow is 81 years old. She appeared on Broadway in 2025. She has outlived 3 of her children, survived the most public custody battle in Hollywood history, and watched the man at the center of that battle continue to work for 30 years. What the last decade of her life looks like, and the specific, impossible question of what accountability means in a story where 3 children died and nobody noticed, is the final part of this story. That is coming.